Hi, my name is Daniel Stepanic. I'm a reverse engineer at Elastic Security Labs. Today I want to talk about an interesting backdoor that we see picking up momentum in the e-crime space. We recently saw some changes in August with some new additions of event handlers and updates we think are interesting. And the goal of the talk is to kind of bring and raise awareness for WARMCOOKIE, as we think it's a threat, a notable threat, and it's part of the whole ransom delivery process. So today, what we'll do is we'll do a little bit of high-level introduction. We'll go through some of the campaign analysis. We'll look at the landing pages, the infection chains, and then the rest of the talk will focus on some of the malware analysis and then the tooling and kind of close out from there. So yeah, like at a high level, we can talk a little bit about WARMCOOKIE and how it fits into today's landscape, right? So the malware ecosystem is just crazy. You know, there's lots of rapid changes each year, and a lot of that is due to these major takedowns that are taking place, right? So like several years ago, you had major players like Emotet, IcedID, PIKABOT. Those families have kind of transitioned, they're gone. We have new families coming in. These major takedowns like Operation In-Game, you know, they're impacting these families like PIKABOT Loader. There's a bunch of just like changes that are happening, and part of these changes I think are leaving gaps. And these gaps create new ways or new like entrances for new families. And that's how kind of WARMCOOKIE fits into this, right? So WARMCOOKIE is kind of a backdoor. It's distributed in two different ways that our team has observed. It comes in through email, and it also comes in through these kind of fake software updates, like fake updates, if you're familiar with that family. It gets distributed through that as well. So we kind of give it a term like it's a lightweight backdoor. The key for WARMCOOKIE is that it's enabling the threat actors with very quick access. It's part of this initial access broker system. So these threat actors are looking to get hands-on keyboard access as fast as they can, move to their Cobalt Strike implants, and then move to ransomware and to other post-compromise activity. What kind of makes WARMCOOKIE a little bit interesting is that it's got a slower approach. It's not distributing the malware every single day. It's region-specific. The lures are really well written. They end up being targeted to individuals. And from our side, it looks pretty successful. So before I get started, I wanted to give a couple shout-outs to a bunch of different vendors in the community space. eSentire was the first vendor that really discovered WARMCOOKIE. At that time, we didn't know what it was, our team didn't, but they found it and kind of, they didn't give it a name, but we'll go into it more. But they're the ones that really discovered WARMCOOKIE. And then there was a great blog post by a company called GData. They refer to WARMCOOKIE as bad space, and they went through the infection chain from kind of the web delivery, the fake updates side. This talk, I'll focus more on the email side. And then also there's a great community piece to this. That's a group called CryptoLamus. They did a really good job of impacting some of the Emotet campaigns, IcedID, and WARMCOOKIE is one of the families that they've also brought awareness to the community. So to kind of get started with WARMCOOKIE, we have to start with the first eSentire discovery. So this was in June 2023. They did a really cool job. They dropped about 4 different incidents. One of those incidents, number 2, they talked about a file that was dropped called resident2.exe. This was the early form, the early version of WARMCOOKIE. It had a bunch of code overlap. It matches the same kind of bot ID fingerprint calculation that WARMCOOKIE does. It implements the same RC4 string decryption, encryption algorithms, and it's got like the same masquerade and the scheduled tasks that get set up every 10 minutes. At that time, the RC4 key looked like a GUID string. The handlers were focused on post-execution, but it was using shell32 and certutil.exe. So from our side, you know, when we ran into WARMCOOKIE, we saw this kind of comparison. You know, it's not exact code overlap, but it was very similar in behavior. So this is a couple screenshots from the checksums that WARMCOOKIE does, and it does this as part of the bot ID identification process. So like on the top is the resident campaign where they'll use the get volume information, they'll use the username and the computer name, and they'll calculate a checksum. These are the same steps that WARMCOOKIE did, and this is how we kind of found the eSentire work that was done before. So kind of coming back to our timeline, this is kind of from our research point of view, we found 3 infections for WARMCOOKIE in April 2024. At that time, we started to watch it, and then on May 5th, there was a recruiting kind of staffing impersonation campaign that we observed through emails. And then we decided to write a blog post in June. And then at that time, shortly after in August, there was a new version, a new campaign. They updated some things. And then today, I'm doing some of the presentation here. So let's go through some of the kind of infection chain, the emails, and I'll kind of highlight some of the stuff that they do. So the infection chain is kind of unique. I wouldn't say it's like too sophisticated, but there's a lot of steps. There's a lot of stages to it, and they've kind of thought about this in advance, right? So I'll kind of cover the recruiting theme one at the top. So this was in May 2024. So these campaigns, they're starting out with email. Within there's an email link that's embedded. And then there's always going to be this gate redirection. So the victim is going to step through kind of this proxy thing that's going to like identify the victim. And then eventually, if it allows them through, they'll go to a landing page. Once they hit the landing page, then there'll be some JavaScript, then PowerShell, and then eventually, they'll use run DLL 32 to execute a DLL. So this is kind of a similar step that we saw in August, where they're doing the same thing. This time it was more generic. They're using PDFs, then a gate, and then eventually, JavaScript, then PowerShell. So, the emails to me are pretty interesting. They spend some time, focusing on their victims, and they clean up the emails pretty well. These are like specific, around the recruiting theme emails that we saw in May. They usually spoof the sender, like this is one for the page group. The sender is page group recruitment. The subject lines are really enticing for people. So they're getting people to click. They say, hey, we have a new opportunity. We're interested. Hey, do you want to apply to this job? They do a lot of, reiterating the person's position, the person's current employer, their email. They're trying to make it official as they can, right? And then they do a job where they're like, hey, we have an internal leak for a position available for you. Click this URL. Let's get in touch. So there is some thought into it, and the one piece that I thought was interesting is that they use real employees from these firms. So like these recruiting firms like Michael Page, they'll use their real names, the real people that work there. You'll check LinkedIn, and they do exist. And so like people might do some of their diligence and be like, okay, hey, this could be legit, but it is really not. So from some of the research, this is like another email that we saw from Michael Page. It's saying, hey, could you be our next project manager? And they always like compliment the users typically. Hey, like you did a good job with this. Did you get this certificate? Oh, check out this link here. And so we saw 3 different firms. These look like international recruiting firms like Adecco, Hayes, and Michael Page. They specifically target and impersonate these recruiting firms. And like kind of going back to the redirectors, they always use these redirectors. So these are like a way to distance the threat actor from the landing pages. And what they do is they leverage compromised infrastructure. So think of like WordPress websites. These are just victims that don't really know what's going on with their infrastructure. I don't know how they're getting in exactly, but they're compromised, and they're using these to kind of redirect straight to their landing pages. And I included a couple of screenshots. You can see just like some of the web pages, they offer like vague products, like gambling. There's like, you can tell that they've been kind of compromised, and they use them for SEO stuff as well. So from my side, how I can kind of like validate these campaigns is I look at the URL submissions in VT. So if I go to like the same day that the campaigns happen, like this was on May 3rd, I can see a lot of users are doing URL submissions. So like 80 URL submissions on the same day of the campaign in May. And then in July, there's like 90 URL submissions around the same day of the campaign. So these are people, victims that I believe that are sending these in, checking to find like, are these malicious or not? And so there is some impact. I know that people are receiving these emails and checking these links out. So from my side, from those links, we resolved like 117 domains. This is at least, there's probably a lot more. These all kind of resolve to this one IP address. And this IP address is really used to like host these landing pages. And you can see kind of the flexibility. They change the domains like on a weekly basis, and then they plug the different recruiting firms like at the top, and then they always use, that .top TLD domain at the end of the URL. So like if you're not looking closely at the link, you might think it's like legitimate. They take advantage of that for sure. So yeah, getting into the landing pages is kind of a big piece of this, right? They do a really well-crafted job of personalizing these landing pages. It'll say things like, hey, access is limited to you. One thing that they do, I think that is unique, like on the top right, is there's a shot clock timer. So there's a countdown that kind of forces the user to think, hey, do I need to actually like click this in a certain amount of time? It gets them to kind of wonder like, this might not last, so maybe I need to click and see what's gonna happen, right? And then a big component of this is the CAPTCHA challenge. Like from a non-technical or non-security user, this is like a really super interesting use case. A lot of people might think that like, hey, someone's trying to compromise me. They're not gonna add a security control. They're not gonna make it harder for me to click and find out like about this job link. So maybe it is legitimate, right? So they kind of take advantage and prey on these victims that really don't know, and that they make it very enticing, right? Very action-oriented. Hey, this is expiring soon. You have a certain amount of time to fill it out. So like during the research, one piece that I thought was kind of interesting was the landing page. This was previously reported, like this exact landing page was reported by Google and some Ursnif, like some banking Trojan malware that they reported on. So from my side, it makes me think, is it the same distributor but a different kind of malware, right? This is WARMCOOKIE this time, but did they like they distributed Ursnif in the past? So yeah, and this is just a look at some of the shot clock timer that I call it, the countdown timer. This is real JavaScript code that they run on the landing pages. You can use this to kind of track the threat over time, but yeah, it calculates like till midnight to the next day. So it's just doing a countdown and it's running code live, and the user just sees the clock ticking when they're on the web page. So yeah, going back to like the next campaign in August, this is a different kind of flavor. This is a United Rentals, like you can rent equipment. This is a more generic lure, right? This isn't targeting specific really individuals. It's super generic. They attach like a PDF with it. It says like it's titled attachment. You open it up. It's got a nice little image, and then you double click it, and then you eventually go through the chain. Like near the end of the chain is some JavaScript. So like, I don't know, if you mess with JavaScript, you don't really write like 7.5 megabytes worth of JavaScript, but they do include that. And part of that, I think, is to just make this stuff more benign. So they end up taking like a real report, like a 2022 European e-commerce report, and they put this in the JavaScript, and then they bury the URL for the kind of the first link into WARMCOOKIE. So you can kind of see where the report starts, and then it kind of is inside this JavaScript. So when you run it, it actually takes some time. It's pretty funny. It takes like 20 or 30 seconds to run. Your CPU is just churning through the JavaScript. But yeah, if you look really close enough, yeah, they just kind of bury it in there. They don't really obfuscate it that well, but then they'll concatenate, mix it together, and then eventually you'll have your link for the next WARMCOOKIE stage. Cool, so now we can kind of get into kind of the malware analysis piece of it. Yeah, so like WARMCOOKIE, from my side, it really does match the standard maldev kind of starter kit. They do dynamic API resolving. They have anti-sandbox. They do string encryption. They use mutex. They configure bot IDs, and they use RC4. So it's very standard malware. If you've analyzed malware, it's really not too complex to analyze. The big thing with WARMCOOKIE is that it comes in two different stages. So you have your landing page, right? You hit the landing page, you download the JavaScript. When you execute the JavaScript, that's actually going to launch PowerShell. And PowerShell is churning and churning, and it's actually going to be using bits, the service that's going to end up downloading the DLL. And so these guys end up hosting the DLL at this particular IP. They always host them on IP addresses. And it's going to go grab the WARMCOOKIE DLL, and then it's going to execute it. So it executes it with the start export, and this is just to get the malware running. This is like stage one. So they execute the malware, they get it running, it gets installed, and then once it's installed, it goes through this process of doing the anti-analysis checks, anti-sandbox, and then it creates a scheduled task. So the scheduled task is really what's kicking off WARMCOOKIE. They configure the scheduled task with this command line with the /u. This is kind of what tells the malware, hey, let's get going. This is going to enter like the handler and really kind of kick off the malware. So the scheduled task is set up for every 10 minutes. So yeah, as I mentioned before, like, yeah, it'll use a dynamic API, so the imports are kind of hidden at first. But all these imports, the functions, they're all kind of encrypted. What they end up doing is just using get module handle W and get proc address. And then they'll resolve all the standard DLLs that you need to kind of do network functionality, take screenshots, those kinds of things. One thing that they kind of do that's more OPSEC like oriented is that they do wipe the strings after the resolution. So they'll use it, then wipe it. So it's possible, like if you have Yara rules and things on just generic strings, that it might not be that great of a rule if they're wiping these strings like within memory. So yeah, coming back to kind of the string encryption, this is pretty standard. We see this a lot like in the e-crime space. You know, the encrypted strings are stored within like as global variables inside the R data section. So if you look at it like this, it looks like just kind of like a bunch of gibberish. Here's a bunch of global variables. They have a custom structure and a function that they use with RC4. I've seen this in different stealers before. I don't know if it's part of like a tool that they're using, but it follows kind of the same schema. So the first 4 bytes are the size of the encrypted string, then the next 4 bytes are the RC4 key, and then the next bytes that follow that are the actual encrypted string itself. So it's pretty straightforward to decrypt all these strings, and like this is an example that you can do at home with the global memory status EX. So yeah, once it kicks off, it does a couple different anti-sandbox checks. These are pretty standard within the industry. They look for the number of processors first, so they're trying to avoid sandboxes. This is done through a call to get native system info. With this call, it passes a system info structure, and then part of that structure is the number of processors. So all they're interested in is grabbing the number of processors on that one. And then the next one is related to memory checking. So they want to grab the physical memory. How much RAM memory does that machine have on that box? They do this through the global memory status EX call. Then they'll do like a small shift of the bytes. But yeah, it's all based on the total physical memory, and then they'll do a calculation after that. So they have a couple different logical checks that they go through, conditions that have to be met for it to run. Does it have 4 processors greater than or equal to 4? You know, does it have 4 gigs of memory? Okay, execute. Does it have 8 processors or more? Execute. 8 gigs of memory? Okay, execute. If not, then it's not going to run. So these are kind of the standard checks to get it to go. And then as the malware kicks off, some things that it does, right? It wants to identify the victim. And a way that it does that, it tracks that through these checksums. These checksums that it uses are like the hard-coded mutex, the volume serial number, the computer name, and the username. And with those checksums, what they do is they just use CRC32, and then they use a seed. So they start the seed from like from 0 or like in -1, and then they're able to like just vary the CRC32 checksum however they want. And yeah, this is the 2 examples that they use from the victims' environments. Like they'll take the mutex and then they'll XOR it with the volume serial number. That's one checksum that they grab. And then they'll take the CRC32 checksum of the username and then XOR it with the CRC32 of the host name. So they're just trying to identify the victims as much as they can and make sure that they're unique. And so yeah, for the next pieces, we can talk a little bit about the newest changes. So these just happened in August. And they made a lot of different changes. For the biggest thing I would say is they did a lot of code optimization. They made it more performant, and they removed a lot of inline code. I think they're trying to do some detections, like try to mitigate some things. I don't know. They swapped the second stage command line from a /p to a /u. It's not anything complex, but that is something that they changed. And then something that they added was they randomized the folder names and the task names where WARMCOOKIE will get installed. So before, all the WARMCOOKIE infections were hard-coded. They always existed in this program data folder, this RTL UPD, and they always had this RTL UPD.dll all the time. They've gotten rid of that. They've moved to more randomization for the folder names, and then now they use updater.dll. From my side, I've seen a hard-coded string that they're starting to add, and then they send from the victim. This looks to me like a campaign ID. So they're getting a little bit more mature to me. And then they've also added 4 new handlers as well. At the end of the day, it's still the same checksum stuff, implementations that they're using. It's still, the string encryption is the same. A lot of it is the same. But yeah, here's a couple screenshots. I think you can tell really quickly which ones are the new version and which one's the old version. This is the code optimization that they've done. Like in the August version, you can kind of see the handlers are all at the same level. So they've cleaned out a lot of code. They're working on it, right? They're changing it, they're cleaning it, and it's actually easier to reverse this way. So it's kind of funny. Some new additions that they did, I call this like a string bank. So they added this new version where they'll take the directory names and the task names and kind of randomize them. So this is like, they have 56 encrypted strings inside, and then they'll use 23 of them, and then 23 of them are fake. And so the ones that are in green right there, those are the ones that are actually used, and then the ones that are in black are not used. So it's just kind of interesting. They're getting more mature in this space to randomize it. So like if you ran WARMCOOKIE 10 times, hopefully you'd get like you'd get different folder names each time. And the way they do the randomization is based on the git tick count. So yeah, this is just an example of the folder names that they use just to kind of show you what it would look like. So updater.dll, and then you have the random folder names that they use, like Tyrannosaurus Tech, TechSpark. If you do put these like in VirusTotal, like in VT-grep, you might find some other interesting things, I think. It might correlate to like other different families. And yeah, and I put the link to the gist if you want to like see all the different paths that they use. So yeah, the network communication side, it's pretty straightforward. It uses C2 over HTTP. It's port 80. What they do first on the initial GET request is they have a cookie data. It's protected through base64 and RC4. And then the post request, when they grab data from the victim, they send it out, and then they just RC4 encrypt it. From my side, the RC4 key is always hard-coded in every sample, and they do reuse it across different samples. They'll change it over time. It's possible that, those are different actors, different affiliates with different keys. And then that's kind of a way to maybe you can identify, hey, it's separate groups or teams that are using WARMCOOKIE. But yeah, each sample comes with the hard-coded IP. If you're familiar with like iced ID and stuff, like there's no configuration. These are just straight up embedded in the malware itself. And then we'll look at the checksum verification as well, but they do a bunch of checksum checks, which I think is a little bit interesting. But yeah, here's a good example of the cookie request structure. This is the data before it's like encoded and encrypted. It might be a little bit hard to see some of the structure, but yeah, there's different fields for checksums that they calculate based on the whole data itself. So like all this data, they'll end up calculating it and put it in the checksum. And then the C2 server is going to always check to verify this data. Does it match the checksum? And that's a way, I think, to just keep researchers from prying and sending requests to the C2 server. But yeah, this data includes a bunch of information within the cookie. It contains the OS information, the host name, the hard-coded mutex, the username, and then you'll see like base64 a lot. They'll use base64 to kind of encode the information. But yeah, here's a high-level example. You have the cookie, RC4, base64, and then the cookie data. So that's how it all kicks off. All this data is then placed into the cookie. And then the network communication side, you have C2 data. This looks kind of ugly to me, but this is how they do it. They send the data through post requests. I call this like raw form. This is what it looks like if you have like network capture. It would look pretty disgusting. You could kind of tell maybe there is encryption going on. But yep, that's what it would look like. And so yeah, these are the handlers. So there's 11 handlers now in total. There used to be 7. They added 4 new handlers since August. All these new handlers are really kind of similar. They're all focused on post-execution. And we'll kind of go through some of those. But yeah, first is kind of the victim information, the retrieval. The handler 1, this is all about victim information. It's going to grab the IP address, processor information, and the physical memory. This is just a way for them to identify the victim and understand, what environment did they land in, and then they'll base 64 encode that in the structure and then send it back to the C2 server. The second handler is focused on screenshot grabbing. This is a huge utility used by threat actors. This is another way they identify what victims they're on. They can quickly see what's on the user's desktop, what are they working on, what are they doing. Potentially they could grab like MFA or certain things to move forward as well. But it uses standard Windows graphics DLLs like GDI, GDI+, and standard APIs. And these images are not compressed. They're kind of sent over. And then some other fingerprinting stuff they do is they get the installed programs. This is pretty straightforward. They check the registry key uninstall, and they get the display name, the display version, the install date, and then they delimit it after base 64 encoding it. So this is all just enumerating. They're trying to understand what victim, where they're at, what programs they have installed. And this is kind of the meat of what WARMCOOKIE is about, is execution. So they have a handler for straightforward execution. This is just like CMD with the /C. So then you can pass any kind of command that you want, and then it'll run it. Like this is a whoami command, and it will fall under run DLL, CMD, and then whoami. Based on that command, they'll use peek, name, pipe, and then read file to read the output. The output is always going to be base 64 encoded for them. And then what WARMCOOKIE does is they have a bunch of error messages as well. So like this is the threat actor. They put this in the malware like, okay, no output data. So these are like messages for them to understand what's going on. So they have file write capabilities. I won't spend too much time on it, but yeah, they can't write to the file. They'll send an error message. They have a file read capability. They provide a file path. This one's a little bit interesting because it's got an error message. When it's okay, they say, hey, go check out the Files tab. So they either have like some GUI component, like a web panel or some GUI where they're working off a tab, and then they can see like, hey, here's the data for this file, and we can read off of that. So the new handlers that they added, like this is one of them, PE, file execution. This is straightforward. What they are doing with this is they're creating new folders, and then the attacker the server would end up providing the PE file, and within that new folder, they kind of concatenate a random name, and then with the string dat, and then they write the PE file with a random name, like this one is 40FC, and then they execute it through the handler. So this is all about just getting them to drop the binaries on disk and then execute them. It's pretty loud and noisy. If you have standard EDR capabilities, you should be able to spot this stuff and find it out. But this is kind of what the process tree is like, and then they have result messages like error codes like success 1, error 0. And then they have like a handlers for DLL execution. So the attacker would come in, they provide their DLL from the server, and then they provide the export. And it's a similar setup. They drop the DLL in the temp folder with the DAT string, and then they execute it through there. And this is an example of using like a script to emulate it. And then lastly, PowerShell. They use PowerShell to do some of the execution as well. Similar concept, they drop the PowerShell, they rename it on disk, and then they execute it through run DLL 32. And then lastly, for the execution side, this one's kind of interesting, is they hard code this export. So I don't know if they're using Cobalt Strike or something else, but they have a DLL with the start export, and then they use the command line /update. So it's possible they have like a chain or another malware that they're going to be executing, but it's always hard coded. So if you go to handler 10, you execute it, it's going to need to have the start export, and then it uses the /update. So my guess is that they have kind of a workflow, like a DLL, maybe it's Cobalt Strike or something else that they're constantly using during post-compromise engagements, and they are using this handler all the time. And then, yeah, this is the last handler. It's just called self-removable. They delete the scheduled task, and then they delete the WARMCOOKIE DLL from the location. This includes like a screenshot. This is how they kind of enumerate the string bank. I thought it was kind of interesting. They do some comparisons, and then they loop over the data, and then they check the job name for the scheduled task. And based on if it matches, then they'll get rid of the scheduled task. So yeah, with closing, I just wanted to share a few tools that we wrote. There's a string decryption tool if you're using IDA Pro. It works for the latest version and the previous versions. And then at the same time, we have tooling that replicates the server. So you can execute it like in a closed environment, pass your DLLs, pass your EXEs. and then it's going to run it, and then you would have the full ability, if you have like an EDR, to see the chain, and then you can build detections and come up with new strategies for detecting WARMCOOKIE. So yeah, in closing, pay attention to WARMCOOKIE. It's an active code base. It's super interesting. I think it's filling in the gap, and it's moving more to a transition to a more hands-on keyboard sort of access. Thank you so much. And then here are the different links for everything, and feel free to reach out to me. Thank you.